Hello, and welcome back to the channel. The plan for this video is to discuss a couple topics. First, I'm going to talk about my in-ear measurements of the TinHiFi P1 Max. I also want to discuss post-EQ measurements, talking about my expectations and then what the actual results were. And lastly, discuss some thoughts on why taking more than just one set of measurements would have changed the results. Starting with baseline P1 Max frequency response then. So this data is transposed from Clinical's measurements off his 711 clone coupler, so not the newer 5128 system. Keep in mind, this does have the 8K resonance peak, and we see that on the graph. And then some other oddities with the P1 Max is there's a dip in the mid-range of about 500, at about 500 hertz. And also the upper treble, 3000 to 5000, is a little more relaxed. And then I'm working on a system and process to recreate this type of frequency response, but rather from how we actually hear it. So this would include picking individual frequencies and being able to say something like, I hear 500 hertz this loud, I hear 600 hertz this loud, 3000 hertz this loud, and then being able to represent that graphically. So right now, the results of that system look like this. So now showing how I hear the P1 Max. And with how different those two curves are, let's talk through some of them. So one of the more obvious differences is the lack of any ear gain region between these two curves. And part of that is how IEMs bypass most of the ear structure. So where headphones you would want an ear gain from it interacting with your ear, headphones, I'm sorry, IEMs bypass a lot of that and almost go more towards the eardrum, where it seems like in the measurements I'm taking, more of a flat line between 1000 to 4000 hertz is what we'd want to see. Another large difference is this peak at 5000 hertz that just is not there in Clinical's measurements. This could have been from the specific two flange ear tip that I was using versus a more conventional tip. It also could have just been from how I heard 5000 hertz that day. Maybe there was something where I was numb to it, but that is an odd one. And then it's difficult to talk about the 7 to 10,000 range because we don't know what's actually supposed to be there because of the coupler resonance. And the other main difference is this large peak at about 1500. And this seems to be a function of my head, my ears, and it shows up on all of the stuff that I measure this way. But with IEMs, the relationship between 1500 and 3000 is pretty significant, so that peak stands out more. Moving on to similarities, we haven't really talked much about anything below 1000 hertz, and it tends to mostly follow a similar curve to Clinical's measurement. I I heard 500 hertz a little lower than how it measures this time, but for the most part, below 1000 hertz is pretty similar. And it may not immediately look like it, but the upper mid-range also follows a similar profile in this range. Right, so Clinical's measurements looks to show that 3500 hertz is quieter than 2000. 3500 is lower than 2000. And then my measurements also duplicate that, where 3500 is lower than 2000. So while the two curves aren't aligned, they do follow a similar trend or similar slope in that area. But that raises the question then, if any measurements aren't going to show ear gain this way, then what would be a good target curve? And this might not be the right answer, but this is what I've been referencing. This curve is what I've been referencing. So essentially there's a bass boost at and under 200 hertz, and then it's pretty flatlined up until about 4000, 5000, where it starts to taper off in the upper treble. It looks like the P1 Max follows a similar curve in the treble range already. Like, yeah, 5000 hertz is a little above it, and so is 10,000, but it kind of follows that downward sloping trend. But there's still some things that we could potentially address with EQ if we wanted to. So that's the idea. If I apply an EQ to go from my in-ear measurements to this target curve, I was wondering how similarly do I hear it with that EQ applied? So applying the EQ and then retaking the measurements, show a curve like this. So it looks much more level, and the main peaks of 1500 hertz, 5000 hertz, and even 10,000 hertz are either gone or much more in line with the other frequencies around them. It is a little strange to see the sub-bass and bass areas be lower when those areas should not have been really affected by the EQ. And then we look at the upper treble range. This is lower than I would have expected it to be. Like I would have thought it would have more closely matched the target, but it does have a more similar shape, and it is much more pleasant to listen to versus having the peaks at 5 and 10K. If I go back and show this one, the blue line is much more pleasant than the up and downs of the other one. So, so while the process has evolved a little bit to be more consistent over time, there's still a couple things. That said, a couple I- that said, being only off by a decibel or two is not that bad. I've lost my spot. I'm sorry. But I will say both these measurements, the in-ear measurements and the post EQ measurements, were taken off one set. So only one time through. There was no averaging involved, and I think we would agree that that's probably not ideal. And that could be why some of these results look a little off. So had I taken more measurements before creating the EQ, or getting a better representation of how I actually heard it, there could have been better values for that EQ, and that could have gotten me closer to the target. So even with data, I still prefer listening to these IEMs with the EQ enabled. I much like this response, but this has still been an interesting concept to explore pre and post EQ frequency responses. And if this type of information resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for joining me today. We'll talk more next time.